This is the eighth presentation at the 2021 BAPT type Centenary Symposium, Bridging the Gap with Academia. So welcoming here for his talk, Dario Nardi.
Yes, thank you. And the topic today is no small set of things: brains, psyche, and epistemology. And in this talk about what is, back and forth in this dialogue about what is type, what is trait, what are we assessing, what are our assumptions, it really bothers me. There are these really fundamental questions that don't get attended to at all many times. And I have to thank someone too, Linda Behrens, for really bringing this to my attention some 25 years ago. Like, what kind of systems are we talking about when we're talking about psyche? So brains, that's what people mostly know me for working with. I've done that since 2006, but really working hands-on, looking at, among other things, what is going on, what is the relationship between personality and brain activity or brain wiring, also looking at career, sex, age, culture, whatever I can get my hands on. And something I just want to say as an overview that the brain is a dynamic system, and there are specific tools and concepts to study such systems. Statistics generally is something that came along a good 80 to 100 years before the tools for modeling dynamic systems came along. And in many cases, statistics can be deployed in order to work with dynamic systems, but there's a lot of problems with that. Similarly, there's a lot of people, I've only encountered one person in academic psychology who knew anything about dynamic systems. And yet that's what the brain is. And presumably when we're coming, at least from a Jungian point of view, and thinking about psyche, because his sort of seminal work was psychological types, not personality types, that we're talking about dynamic systems. So this presentation will explore strengths and limitations of using brain imaging and neuroscience generally to study personality. We're going to discover some things along the way, like, are types even a legitimate concept? Do they exist in nature? And also touch on some, well, the epistemology part of it as well. Which begs the question, maybe I should define what those are. And I want to say that on some of these slides, I put more information than I'm going to say, because people may want follow-up references. So like this thing on epistemological levels and Thomas Kuhn. So folks can look at this and look it up later. What do I mean by epistemology? So this is like, what is knowledge and how can we know what we know? There are various people who've looked at this over the decades. Of course, they're making some assumptions about what is knowledge in order to even answer this question. And one of those, sort of, and there are different models of this, but, does one take almost like a childlike realist point of view? Is there like a single answer to what is knowledge? Is it very relativistic and constructionist, or is there some kind of more sophisticated process? So I just want to bring into awareness that these are questions that maybe we want to ask. Not that we have to go into detail about them when looking at personality, but if we don't have some answer for them, then we really can get into trouble. So ontological levels is something that's related, and that's how do we group phenomena into domains. And the example that I like to use is physics, chemistry, and biology. And in theory, a biologist could express everything that they do in physics equations, but in practice, they don't do that. Why do they not do that? Because the biology, even though it depends upon the physics, has its own unique phenomena and its own nomenclature. And it's appropriate to work at this different level. This is why we have different departments. It's not merely an accident of history. Chemistry and biochemistry sitting somewhere, along the spectrum. Same with psychology, social psychology, and sociology. So in theory, a sociologist can use something like multi-agent modeling, or some other theoretical tool that's psychology focused in order to understand what's going on. It would be social psychology. So really, we wonder then when we talk about personality or psychology, like what level actually are we working at? There's also objective versus subjective approaches to doing the research. Like, are we looking at something that's measurable, like, along a spectrum, like a thermometer? Action research, by the way, is a form of objective activity. We can have some kind of structured process where we present, look at, tweak, represent what it is that we're doing. Subjective approaches could be things like introspection or structured interviews. I really present those as sort of, they're along a spectrum, but just to say there are these different approaches. And type has, in addition to the MBTI instrument, which is intending to be objective, it does have in practice a long history of profiling others. That's a very much more subjective approach. And there is that essential ethics piece, which says that the individual is the final arbiter of their best fit type. I don't think there's an equivalent in the Big Five community or in DISC or whatnot. The individual is the final assessor of that. There's also some questions about like, what is it that we're actually working with? So sometimes we hear the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. And the theory is something that's more established, like the theory of evolution. Hypothesis is like, well, you know, we haven't even started the research yet, or we're getting into it. Peter Geyer, who's a type historian, has said that Jung's work is not a model, it is a framework, it's a clinical framework. And we should not be calling it a model. It was also Carol last week who presented and posted a paper as well by a gentleman arguing that the five-factor model actually doesn't qualify as a model and should not be called that. It could be called five-factor approach, something like that. Why is that important? Because then it gets into like, what is the purpose of what it is that we're doing? So aren't neuroscience and personality different levels? And that's very so important to start off with. So I'm not going to make the mistake of saying, oh, well, I'm seeing this pattern in the brain and that's what your type is. I mean, I could say that, but then we aren't talking about psychological type anymore. And of course, clinicians and academics in general tend to work at different epistemological levels. So it's, you know, it's really, this is sort of the landscape that we're coming from. And then we want to distill down from this and make it a little bit more concrete. So one of the ways that I do this is to say there's brain, mind, and psyche. So there's this electrobiochemical system. It's the hardware, what's actually called wetware. And this is primarily the domain of neuroscience. There's also mind. And for those of you coming from neuroscience, I have news for you. Mind and brain are different. They necessarily are mind. If we're talking about information processing and mental functions, remember that there's a lot of mental functions which can be implemented in a computer. A computer is not a wetware brain. So there's these activities that we can do, and those sometimes get captured in type, like thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. These are functions that are presumably processing information in some way. Inferring, storing, recalling, outputting, sorting, inputting. So the brain does all of these things. The computer can do many of these things. And this is primarily the domain of cognitive science. And then there's psyche, you know, that word psychological types. And I think it's Mina Barmani, even in all of her work with the statistical analysis and the majors PTI and the CPA, that reminding us that Jung's framework was a clinical framework about consciousness and the unconscious, which includes the whole person, the environment, and is expressed via the mind and instantiated in the brain. So this is not saying that psyche is somehow magically different than the brain. It gets instantiated in a certain way, but it is a different level in the same way that physics, chemistry, biology are different levels that are related to each other. But we sort of want to remember to say, like, you know, are the Jungian functions simply information processing? Well, that's not what he intended, is best I understand it. And this is supposedly the domain of psychology, the psyche. But maybe a lot of people lose track of that connection sometimes. So what is the brain? The brain is a dynamic living system. It's one organ of a dynamic living system. That's like one element in an ecology. So we can ask, what tools are we going to use to study the brain? And that's sort of a very natural, immediate step that somebody wanting to do a research study is going to do. Well, can we do fMRI or EEG or near infrared or something like that? And that's great, but there's beyond the brain. So the nervous system actually includes quite a lot. 80% of the signals that run through the nervous system run upward into the brain, not outwards. So even though the brain looks very significant, is not the only piece. And then there's personality, which might also be influenced by the endocrine system, by the family relation system, which is outside of the person. So really, we want to ask when doing neuroscience, what ontological and epistemological levels are we working at? Why? And are there other levels that may be more appropriate, or at least that we need to address as we go along, so that we don't make a confounding error like saying studying the brain can tell us or cause a person's psychology. It may embody that psychology that's different from saying, or it mediates, it's different from saying it causes it or reveals all of it. So this is another framework, little framework that I use. And I was reminded along the way, I originally had 3 levels and that there was a level 0. So how do we explain something? Well, level 0 is just because. And then there's this rule-based kind of thinking, which started off in artificial intelligence and is found throughout the legal world and many human institutions, sort of if this, then that, else this other thing. And that a single exception can disprove the rule. I've also found in my personal observation that whatever it is that we don't like a meme that we don't like, that we tend to subject that to rule-based thinking if we're going to put some thinking into it. Well, there was this one exception, therefore the whole thing is wrong. There's another level, which is the statistical analysis, and I use that in a very broad sense. So there are ways, percentages, we can talk about room for error, we can talk about uncertainty, we can give like, p-values and r-values and whatever kind of measures we want to use, is suited. And I think it's important to remember that it was designed to study large populations and or repeated behaviors. And, when we use a statistical tool, is that actually what we're getting at? Is that what we want to see? And there are a lot of statistical tools. I mean, it's a very developed discipline. And there's another level, which is dynamic systems. So that gets back to the brain being an organ in a dynamic living system. And so social networks are an example of living systems, or at least dynamic systems, ecologies, dynamic living systems, brains. There's a wonderful book called Emergence, a study of ants, brains, city, and there's one more word that they use. Computers. Looking at, what does it mean? What is a dynamic system? Well, there's often many interrelationships, and many of them are nonlinear, and there's a phenomena called attractors in these systems, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And these generally come out of parallel constraint satisfaction, which is another term that you can look up on Wikipedia. In fact, my general answer, if you ask what is this, like what is an attractor, I'm going to say you can just type it into Wikipedia and it will tell you. Not that that's the final answer, but it's a good start. There are actually many math and computer-based systems tools. Like I said, however, I've only met one person in the psychology community who was aware of any of these tools. Of course, in neuroscience, there are neuroscience people who use dynamic systems tools. So a challenge of the techniques we've been using so far, and I mean this not just as a criticism of, say, a trait-based approach. I'm also talking about type and the ways that we evaluate type assessments, even when it's informal, like we're profiling someone. I myself am the creator of an assessment, so I must be wary of this too. And having come from California, let's say a statistical analysis of Earth movement is done of California, and it's going to reveal it's highly stable. In a sense, that absolutely is true. People could not be building there; they could not live there, typical lives at least, if the ground were not highly stable. However, this approach hides critically important phenomena, rare but powerful earthquakes, and then the occasional less powerful earthquake. So the question then becomes what are we trying to look at? Do we end up throwing something out because it doesn't fit what it is that we're looking for? If it doesn't fit within the curve, say the normal curve, then we throw it out, when in fact that might be one of the most important things that we want to know about the system. So we need to make choices as we work with the data, what it is that we're highlighting. Maybe that's a range of data, it's a type of data, whatever it is. And the same with personality. What is it that maybe we end up showing or highlighting? And clearly, something like Big Five approach, and the MBTI indicator, and all of the stuff around that and other instruments, they're saying, like, let's look at this aspect, like team roles, or let's look at that aspect. Although, as Roy said, maybe the team roles actually aren't assessing roles, they're assessing something else. So what is it that we're focusing on? And I believe that type and trait are focusing on different things. There's another issue, and this is actually something very practical. And I don't mean to use this in like a combative way, but somebody did approach me a few days ago saying like, oh, great stuff on neuroscience, but why are you using MBTI? And then sent me to this page with a Vox video. Why anyone would trust something from the general media, I don't know, about how type is terrible and so on. And my response is that actually the Big Five uses a normative approach. And by the way, neuroscience also in some quarters uses a normative approach. And that's really very problematic. There are differences in ethnicity, gender, culture, class, and if things are presented as within a normal range or desirable, like being non or less neurotic, could it be that a person's social class or gender or something like that is quote contributing to that, but it's not quote contributing? We actually don't know how to untangle that. And then something like Big Five characterizations, like for hiring or prediction and performance, become quite problematic at a social level. And I'm happy to say that the gentleman had no response, because that really is something that is very nice about type, and it fits with Isabel Meyer's original vision, that this is something to unite people rather than to divide them. So just one or two more little points before we get into the neuroscience part. And what is it that we're trying to do here? Again, I want to give another example of this. And the way I sometimes explain trait theory versus what I'm going to call a systems theory, which is different from preferences or the Myers-Briggs type indicator. I'm talking more about Jung, because that on the internet is primarily the framework that when people dig beyond the 4-letter code, they get into the quote 8 functions or function attitudes, mental processes, whatever we want to call it. They get into that model. So I really feel like trait, and I have worked with clients where they said, this is what we want to do. And I'm like, 5 factors actually really meets your needs very well. Like, let's use it. And we used it successfully. And it is really great, I'd like to say, if we're shopping for apples in order to bake a pie. Because then we really want to know the traits of the apple. Like, what is its freshness? What is its crispness, sweetness? Like these things that actually really impact the baking of the pie. But if we want to be farmers, orchard tenders, which is maybe more a clinical perspective, or maybe more around what is the dynamic or cyclical nature of the psyche or person's personality, then we want to take a more systems approach, that everything is connected with everything else. So this dynamic systems model is really great. These systems tools, the brain is organized this way. Everything in the brain, not directly connected to everything else, but there's a lot of connections. And so we want to end up saying, instead of that this part of the brain does this or controls that, that it's about influence, it's about mediation, it's about helping that the brain works in networks. And with systems theory, we really want to focus on verbs rather than just the adjectival qualities of something. Like, instead of saying someone is outgoing or neurotic or open. By the way, I love that term outgoing. It's like they go out. That's what it means. They go out. Neurotic is that the nervous system gets stimulated easily. So with the systems theory, is more like a comparing, empathizing, inferring, that these are all verbs, and it takes us more in that realm of mental processes and therefore mind, the information processing level. So that's a nice like mid-level that we can often work at if we can't know what's going on in the psyche directly. Nobody's defined what consciousness is. And anyone who tells you otherwise is taking you for a ride. We will come back to that at the end, though, like what is a technique which is a mathematically established technique for assessing things that we cannot measure directly. So one more piece before we get into the neuroscience, and this is this thing about types. I don't know this, but I have this feeling that there's a lot of individuals out there in psychological research who, when they say something is a type, they mean that cluster analysis revealed there's a cluster that has, like a high correlation. And that's nice as a tool, but the tool doesn't cause reality. It doesn't cause the real phenomena that are out there. And sometimes we can just see phenomena with our eyes. And so to me, there is this question is like, does type only exist as a statistical abstraction that comes about from analysis? Or do types actually exist in nature? And I don't mean like cats and dogs as different types. I mean, those are species, they're plainly different. They don't interbreed. There's standards for how to decide that, but more subtly in something like personality. So yeah, it turns out that in the study of dynamic systems, like the brain, like social networks, like a traffic movement, the formation of neighborhoods, when you boil water on the stove, what you may not see as the water begins to boil is it forms invisible cells. By cells, I don't mean biological cells. I just mean regions of the water that are coherent, that sort of like stay with each other. So in a landscape, what they've discovered of all possible combinations, that only a few ever show up in actual real world systems. So what does that mean? That means if we have 10 variables, and we're going to think like, well, maybe every single combination, each variable can be on or off. So that's going to be 2 to the 10th power. That's going to be like millions of combinations. Oh, don't all of those going to appear in nature? But it turns out, no, like not at all. Complex systems develop what is sort of like we'll call basins of attraction. And again, you can go to Wikipedia and type in basins. Oh, it says on. I'm sorry about that. It's just basins of attraction. You can look at. They're really akin to gravitational wells, and the systems, real living systems, complex systems, are drawn towards these gravitational wells. And as a general heuristic from the 1960s onward, having looked at these in climate, in ecologies, in even in non-living systems, like boiling water or air that follows, in the wake of an aircraft, the number of attractors in a system equals the square root of the number of salient variables. So there isn't such thing as like, well, one is there are types, that there are these coherent things that appear in nature, these basins of attraction. The graphic there sort of illustrates that we have these blue, a marble comes into the space and it's going to end up in the blue, red, or green section, or perhaps in one of those borderline areas. And that's fine. Mark Majors has pointed out, what is it, 80% of people score very easily, clearly with a type, given a standard set of questions, and the other 20% of people need a special set of questions because they land in the border somewhere, and they need a special set of questions to sort further. I think that's perfectly fine, and in fact sort of supports this observation. We also know that in neuroscience, individuals like Dr. Helen Fisher have validated brain types. And this came about more through statistical analysis because that can support types too. They do form in clusters. But I just want to emphasize that types are real things, like the real phenomena out in, well, I don't want to say a thing, but it's a real phenomena out in the world. And that there's a mathematics for capturing and characterizing types. A great example is, I don't know if it's used now, but there's a software piece called Bryce. I think that was 15 years ago, that is used to generate virtual landscapes. And is something going to be a lake or a mountain or fields or whatever it is? And they use these very straightforward algorithms, which are known to generate attractors easily. And you end up with all of these features which look like incredibly natural landscapes. And they're simply generated by a small number of equations underneath. And the equations do not have things like the tree equation. Well, there is one that's specifically for leaves on trees, but for the most part, these elements arrive very naturally, like lakes and mountains and flatlands and so on, because they occur naturally in systems. If you want to know more about this, there are several references here that you can look at. So without further ado, to the second half of the presentation, brain imaging technologies. And so this is what I started off with in 2006. Some of you may have experienced some of these. The two most popular are EEG and fMRI. For studying, and I'm specifically talking about personality or anything psychologically related, whether that's clinical or within the range of normal, sort of non-clinical individuals. It seemed for a time that EEG would pass out of interest in the 90s and everyone would be using fMRI, but that turned out not to be the case because EEG has its own strengths and fMRI has its own weaknesses. There are also other technologies which are emerging, near infrared, the older technologies like PET scans, and each has the benefits and limitations and some bugs. So something interesting that happened with fMRI is that a couple of years ago, they discovered that among the two main pieces of software used to analyze fMRI data, one of them had a subtle but sort of devastating bug in it, which could cause not just hundreds, but thousands of fMRI research studies to be, they need to be redone, reanalyzed, and potentially retracted or republished. So something as simple as that, the analysis part of it is not straightforward, particularly with fMRI. EEG is a little bit more straightforward. So there are these technologies that we can use. They all have strengths and limitations. And that's really, really important to understanding. When we say something like neuroscience, it sounds like a big, magical, mysterious word. But as somebody who's worked hands-on, mainly with EEG, I can tell you, even within EEG, each instrument has its own little quirks. Like each one is like a different dog in a way. So there are some very typical ways that neuroscience works in a laboratory environment. Typically, a psychological experiment is designed to illuminate a specific narrow question. And the subjects, not called people for some reason, they're called subjects. Like there's the lab guru or the lab king has subjects. They're isolated, or minions. They're isolated in a featureless room and they're fed a standardized protocol that they go through of tasks, or maybe just one task. Although usually, even if you're only looking at one task, you sort of disguise it amongst a body of some related tasks. And generally this put on a computer, and it's designed to severely limit the number of variables, independent variables, which is entirely understandable and I would advocate is appropriate in some cases. The counterexample, which is very reputable and I think a great piece of work that's been going on, is the Human Connectome Project, which is a repository of fMRI data where people have gone through this protocol of a variety of tasks, like how I work with people, like they're doing reading and to telling stories, and they're doing math problems and so on, looking at faces, and it's designed to substantiate the functionality of various brain regions and networks. It does isolate people in a giant rumbling machine, the fMRI machine, so it is sort of an antisocial, disturbing experience for people, but it has produced useful results. In another domain, neuromarketing, people can view media, they can interact with products, et cetera, in more natural ways. Like you literally put the cap or the headset on people's heads, and you wireless pieces, and you let them, don't want to say run wild, but you let them go through the marketplace that's been opened for the afternoon just for the experiment, and people go through that marketplace, and we get to see how their brains react as they go down aisle 4, and then they go down aisle 5, and then they stop and see an advertisement or a product, whatever it is. And those also give meaningful results. So we know that we can have more open-ended experiences that are more social, that are more interactive with the environment. I want to say are less like NT environments and more SF environments. And this really, it can work. We can do it. The challenge is that when we really narrow down into artificial circumstances, what are we missing or exaggerating? And of course, when we have open circumstances, then what are the confounding variables? Like, is it evening or morning? There's a variety of things. So there's no like silver bullet I'm very skeptical of the sort of gold standard concept. I understand that some methodologies are generally more functional than others, but gold standards also have their problems. In terms of brain regions, so this is what people know me for quite a bit. And this is not some heretical idea. The brain is organized into anatomically distinct regions and subregions. These are generally known as Brodmann areas. And that's particularly if you use fMRI, you can go to, again, Wikipedia or a neuroscience textbook and look up like Brodmann area 24 or Brodmann area 17 or whatever it is and learn about it. EEG technology that I do also, I mean, it looks at the same anatomical areas, just usually not as many sensors, but it has a shorter, not as high as resolution, not as deep into the brain at all, but very good time resolution. So what about these regions? Well, one is to understand that they don't cause the behavior. Even if there's some very strong correlations, like the regions that are just, I'm going to say under the ears, and those are auditory regions, we say that they help with, they aid, they mediate daily tasks, because in practice, a small subset of regions, sometimes even a big subset, get active when we do specific tasks. So reading might light up just one region, but most likely it's going to light up 2, 3, 4 regions consistently across many people, because reading involves more than just noticing black squiggles on a white page, or if we try and make it more difficult, dark gray squiggles on a red page or whatever it is, that we use our imaginations. We might say the word silently to ourselves. There are different regions involved. Sometimes the whole brain can get active, and occasionally, yes, sometimes only one region might get active. I've seen this in meditators in particular. Deepak Chopra, when I looked at his brain as he meditated, he visualized a mandala, and really it was just this right occipital area that got active, and everything else was crickets. And similar for the mantra that he repeated silently to himself, just the left anterior temporal region got active and everything else in the brain was crickets. So, you know, there's a very disciplined brain there. That was cool to see. For the most part, a multitude of research studies over decades have illuminated which regions aid which tasks. So if you see my work and people wonder where it comes from, I'm like, well, you know, it comes from the established body of neuroscience that's out there. And I've seen it myself as well. So those are where those come from. And it's the beginning, beyond picking the setting up the protocol and picking what kind of hardware, it's sort of the beginning of our journey. Another facet which was discovered beginning in the 1920s, and that's truly where the journey begins historically, is this the idea that the brain is actually this electromagnetic device or element, organ, electromagnetic organ, as well as chemical in this living system of us. And how do we decode that electromagnetic signals? It's actually, we use the same algorithms that we use to decode radio waves. So how does your radio turn to different channels across the FM band, say, and then the volume comes in and we hear all of this stuff? You use the same algorithms to decode what goes on in the brain. Are there some other ways to analyze? Perhaps. That is by far the favorite way. And what they discovered early on over the years is that there are these brain waves, and all of them are present simultaneously to some extent or another into every part of the brain. It's not just like, oh, this part only has alpha waves or this part has only delta waves. They're all present to some extent. So there really are a lot of different layers and complexity to the brain. The slowest, I'll say very briefly, delta is more like a sleeping or maybe deep meditation. Theta is going to be, you can be awake at sort of the edge of sleep. It's also when just doing routine activities that require no additional thinking. It's sort of like when they say you can do it in your sleep, that's sort of where that's happening. Alpha waves often happen with eyes closed when people do visualization, listening to music, meditation. However, you don't have to have eyes closed for it. There's other times alpha is just bringing in this gut feel from the limbic system. And then for a long time in neuroscience, they thought that beta was the end of it. that this was this active, awake, busy person, reward-driven, maybe fearful and anxious at the high end, and that was it. And there was this theory that you can't really go higher than 32 hertz because the cells, the neurons, can't actually signal that fast. Well, it turns out that was very wrong. And they're still sort of trying to figure out how exactly the neurons do signal faster, but they do. And this gamma level is very important. I just realized now in this graphic that I pilfered from the internet actually has the colors backwards or upside down. So it should be blue at the bottom and red at the top, but that was their choice. And gamma waves are really essential for things like consolidation of sensory input for learning, having aha moments. People also show gamma waves when they look at pornography. So I guess that people really, when they see something they like, they're very ready to learn. Maybe that's how we can think of it. In fact, in looking at the brain, I've noticed a lot of stuff that seems evolutionarily, like it could easily be explained in historical or functional terms in terms of evolution, and does not follow some kind of neat conceptual model. So the outcome of all of this up until about 2005, and certainly still in use in publications today, is we're just going to take these different slices of brain waves, wave bands as they're called, like delta and theta and so on, and then look at how active, how loud the brain was in each region. And this technique has, this really reigned supreme for a long time. There is a like 5-factor approach that like looks at these, their personality dimensions and brain activity using EEG. There's not one, but a couple of articles in the Journal of Psychological Type that also do this. They don't go anything beyond to this. One of the challenges with this approach is that it has a reliability of about 2 months. It's also context dependent. So if you change the context, say from a set of 10 tasks, diverse tasks, to simply say 30 minutes of meditation, you're going to get very different results. So to date, overall attempts to link this kind of brain activity with personality traits or dimensions or processes has given lackluster results. I believed, and this is the approach that I used in my 2011 book, my pilot study, I believe that I got decent statistically relevant results because I was working with college students, which is exactly that age when people will be practicing using brain regions that are relevant to their type preferences. So they're not undergoing type development like in midlife. Moreover, I gave them a diverse battery of activities so that it wasn't just one thing that we were looking at. And that was sort of a blessing, but the technology has moved on since then. And where it has moved to is this idea of brain wiring. There is this underlying principle: neurons that fire together are wired together. And here are 3 examples. They're sort of bird's eye view, looking down like the other brain maps here. Again, we're only looking at the neocortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. That's a limitation of EEG technology, only looking at the outer layer. fMRI can look much deeper, but it has its own issues. So we're looking at how these regions fire together in sync. And what I've discovered, which is not a surprise, I mean, we know this from the huge databases that are kept of EEG. It's called quantitative EEG databases. The brain wiring can vary widely between persons. One of those variations, which is established, is between individuals who score high or low on extroversion is a trait. In fact, they've even debated dividing the database in 2 to be fair, or I suppose they would have to divide it into 3 or 5. I don't know. When you have traits, how do you decide where to draw the line of what constitutes a normal brain or a typical non-clinical brain? The point is, though, the brain wiring can vary widely between persons, and the more densely wired regions, in other words, where you see a lot of lines clustered together, those correlate well in my research with personality. Particularly the developed self, particularly with sex for people who are younger, like 15 to 25, with career for 25 to 55, 60, and then maybe not as much of a correlation period after that. And what's great is these maps have a reliability of about 2 years. That's not my data, that's other people who've been doing this kind of analysis of brain wiring for a while. So that tells us then maybe we're getting closer to something that's, even though brain wiring, mind, and consciousness in terms of psyche are three different levels of inquiry and discussion with their own nomenclature, maybe we're converging on something that would be useful, that can really help us out. Because, that's a great thing about type. I sort of feel now, especially with the longitudinal studies coming out, even just with trait measures, it looks like at 5 and 10-year intervals, traits don't change that much. But in a lifespan interval from, say, age 10 to age 70, you compare those 60 years apart, and people do change. And if there's no theoretical framework to explain that, then what are we left with? And fortunately, Jung left us with a framework to understand development, and I feel that's what type superpower is. And fortunately, at least among the I'm going to say, like, internet fans who go beyond the 4-letter code, that is how they think about type, as something that's developmental, maybe in a very sort of like semi-educated way, getting some things wrong at times, but still, this reminds us that, yeah, people do change, and then how can we, and what is it that's changing? Does that mean that type changes? The expression and instantiation of type changes. So I want to mention a little bit about the challenges of doing analysis, because you see these here, and it's like, well, Dario has produced these magical brain wiring maps. And if you Google, well, I don't want to say Google, but, I'm going to say you do an internet search of something called coherence analysis, and then you press on the images tab, you're going to see images that are very similar to this. Some of them use like a different rubric, like they use just a plain old circle with lines across. Others use something that looks more like an actual shape of a brain. But you can do that. And then that's a popular analytical technique. And again, I wanted to talk about, are we using the right tools? That's why I talked about that at the beginning. So there are two methods mainly that are used to come up with these kinds of brain wiring diagrams. One method is coherence analysis, and the other is called Hebbian learning. Coherence analysis has been by far the most popular one for the past 20 years, 15 years. It's a statistical technique that calculates Pearson R between pairs of regions. And one of the challenges is that it has a tendency to locate trivial patterns. For example, during a task, say a 5-minute task, 18 of 20 regions were inactive and 2 were active. This coherence analysis will say that the 18 pairings, those 18 inactive regions had a very high R value, and therefore they're flagged as being a strong network, when in fact, actually, they're not a network at all. They're just generally, they're a hodgepodge of, say, a half dozen networks that are all suppressed. And then what gets lower profile is the 2 that were cooperating with each other, which maybe get, a sort of mediocre to high R value, but don't look as interesting. So the statistical technique to calculate the coherence among these different brain regions yields maps that are sort of untrustworthy. And so there's been a movement in the past 5 years, and I'm very happy to say the last 2 neuroscience people I've been in contact with are both like, oh, we're so glad you're using Hebbian learning. We were thinking that's the best way to go. Where in the other cases, we're finding that's the best way to go. So this algorithm uses network analysis tools. So in other words, remember when I talked about dynamic systems, social networks, ecologies. So it's those kinds of tools. How do we model and analyze an ecology? How do we model and analyze a social network? So there are tools for that, and one of them is called Hebbian learning. I won't go into the details of it. What I will say is it results in a network diagram that we can feed signals into, like we're going to pretend like a simulation, software simulation, and it will duplicate how the brain actually reacts. So this movement away from a static statistical analysis results to a simulation, and then asking, does the simulation accurately reproduce what it is that we're looking at? So it's less popular. It has a shorter track record. It's not a statistical tool. It's relying upon an algorithm, but it is something that's coming into use, and it's the tool that I've been using and the one that I found is producing interesting results. So I think it's just that people need to ask, like, I'm using this tool, it's well accepted, but is it actually measuring what I think it's measuring? So then there's another interesting little phenomenon, and I've noticed, so this is 17 ENFPs. From a certain point a few years ago in my research, I had an intern who, with ENFP preferences, who very gratefully did a whole bunch of in-depth analysis. And we sorted people into 2 career domains. Although it says hard science and soft science, the hard science included business, finance, law, that kind of thing. It's just, it wasn't all undergraduates at this time. It was a mix, about 50-50. And then the soft sciences included social service, humanities, the arts, and so on. And at first we're going to think, oh, these maps look pretty different. Does this mean they're 2 different kinds of ENFPs? We could say that. So maybe there are 32 types or whatever it is. But if you look very carefully at it, what you're going to find, for example, this black set of what look like starburst or sun rays, or maybe you want to think of it as a spider web, which is just purely stylistic to convey that all regions are firing at once, that appears black on the right-hand side. And it appears on the left-hand side, but in gray, so weaker, because the red are the strongest connections, which means strongest actually means that they fire together the fastest, like every 1 second or half a second together in sync. And it's the thalamus, we believe, that coordinates that, but I will get to that at the end of the talk. And then we see a different region, let's say down here in the lower right corner of the right-hand image, where we see something that looks sort of like a trapezoid in a way. That's mostly gray. It has a little bit of red in it. And then as we move over to the image on the left, but also the lower right part of the brain, we see that same trapezoidal shape, but black and red rather than gray and red. So what we find is that one of them is the background of the other one, that it's a background foreground question, that what was, we'll say, like the most strong in one is a secondary strength in the other, and vice versa. So this really gets at some interesting questions about what is it, how do we think about type, and what is it that we're studying? Is it that all ENFPs come with the same skills, essentially, or they try and instantiate them the same way? And yes, we're talking about brain skills, like hearing and reading and doing logical deduction and so on. Or is it, they come with these same skills, and then because of their career, one set of skills comes to the foreground and the other drops to the background. And if they switch professions, eventually there's going to be switching of foreground background. So that maybe is a concept that's not talked about a lot in type, or very much at all, but is an example of how the neuroimaging, the neuroscience, even though brain and mind and psyche are at different levels, may drive how we think about psyche. Many other choices. We can look at brain wiring at each and every wave band. Remember I showed you those 5 different wave bands, like theta and delta and so on. We can have more than one brain wiring map. We could have 5, we could have 10. What about neurotransmitters, other aspects of the nervous system? Limbic system, autonomic nervous system. Maybe temperament is something that shows up in the limbic system. I don't know, who can study that, or who has studied it. To understand the results, do we compare or normalize a set of raw results, like against itself? Do we normalize against a database? That's what QEEG is about. There's an enormous database of thousands of people who've done EEG, and you're just normalized against that. And if you fall outside the normal range, then you've got a clinical issue. Except it turns out that those results can vary by introversion, extroversion. We'll just say the scale of extroversion. That they can potentially vary by socioeconomic class, gender, ethnicity. So what does that mean? When something like 5-factor approach is pushed as predictive of behavior, or that there are certain things which are desirable, like high openness, high conscientiousness, low neuroticism. Fortunately, type doesn't necessarily have to deal with those questions, but it's something to keep in mind. Where is the dividing line between naturally occurring diversity and clinically concerning results? I don't know. Does type talk about this? Is this person an ENFP or are they some other, or ENTP, whatever type it is, ESTP, or is it that they have ADD or ADHD or both? You know, this is one of, and unfortunately people have answered this question. Folks can go to the Milo database, which I take a lot of joy in being part of Facebook forums and so on. People ask questions and I'm like, and here is the CAPT Milo database. And here is the CAPT Milo database. I know that people at CAPT don't like me for whatever reason. They don't know me at all. But I send them people to CAPT anyway, because CAPT has great resources. How do we store and present our data in an ethical and legal way, especially for you folks in Europe? This is an actual legal question. This actually makes it difficult for me to maintain data, potentially for European clients, because they have the capacity to delete their data at any time from my database. They can request that. Or can they? Are there actually legal structures to get around that? And is that, and also how do we present our results ethically? I believe in normalizing brain imaging results so that people who fear that it's going to make them look stupid or they're going to have a slow brain or something like that. No, I'm like, no, your results are normalized. In the same way, the type presents a diversity of different gifts. We have different brains that are gifted in different ways. And then how do we present to the general population in a way that they can understand and make use of, which I feel I've really been tasked to do. So we just have a few more things I want to mention. Some outcomes of brain wiring analysis at that point. One is that it really seems to point to a person's developed self, that the brain is the instantiation of mind and psyche, that it's not the psyche itself. Now, there are materials who will argue consciousness emerges from the material brain, and that's fine. I don't have any quibble with that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying that there is consciousness, and that's one level of discussion that we can have. And then there's another discussion about information processing, which could be about computers, not about brains. And then we can talk about things like neurons and dendrites and so on. Factors that correlate with brain wiring patterns include age, biological sex, career choice, cultural upbringing, personality, maybe long-term relationships. I sort of started to look at that, and likely some other factors. So nature and nurture. People use their brains in a way that meets their practical needs. This is what I say to people, like their work as well as their psychological needs. No, maybe people aren't getting their psychological needs met. Maybe they aren't getting their practical needs met. Maybe they're in the wrong profession. Maybe there's like an element, what is it called, type falsification. People use their brains in different ways, and hopefully, that's that word that maybe needs to be added there, hopefully to meet their practical and psychological needs. The results that I've been getting fit well with the research of Dr. Helen Fisher on neurotransmitter hormonal types. I think it's very promising because it's an entirely different mode of inquiry, looking at neurotransmitters. And I believe that besides general statistical patterns that correlate with particular Jungian functions, we can talk about subtypes of each type. And for those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, you've seen INTJ, INTP, and ENTP. Each type takes a lot of number crunching to go through and a lot of research to look at all the people's demographic stuff and the brain wiring patterns and all of that. But it's is worth it. And I think that's going to give a level of resolution that will resolve a lot of questions around type. And those who say, oh, it's putting me in a box, there are only 16 types only. Thank goodness there's not just only 2 or only 4, but if there are 64 or 128, then it's not really feeling like a box anymore, is it? You know, it's a spectrum, and that's a starting point. And these subtypes, quote subtypes, are really representing developmental paths, developmental spaces that we're in. I said we're going to get to consciousness, and that's the last part I want to talk about in 2 slides, which probably deserves whole books. And correct me if I'm wrong, because there are some folks out there who know more than I do about what Jung said. I mean, Jung said so many things that that's very dangerous to say Jung said. That he was focusing on a clinically useful framework and that his framework is about consciousness and the unconscious. And when we ask then, what is consciousness? Nobody knows the answer to that question. Some people say it's an illusion. I don't think that's a helpful answer. Society is not going to buy that answer, sorry. It could simply be that it's, it's important and it serves some purposes, but it's purely generated by the brain. It could be that actually consciousness is the only thing that exists, and everything else, consciousness being sort of organized self-referential energy. And since the universe at the quantum level is pretty much all energy, maybe that's actually the reality of the situation. What we do know is that consciousness has various facets, which I'm not going to list here, but we all know from sort of waking up to falling asleep, being drunk, maybe being hypnotized. There's these different ways, the aspects of consciousness, levels of consciousness. And that if you cause damage to the brain stem in the reticular formation section, that is absolutely going to wipe out consciousness. A person could suffer severe damage in other parts of the brain and still have consciousness. But this seems really a big deal. And this is sort of cool in a way and has implications because other mammals have this reticular formation section of the brainstem, so they too are conscious. In what ways and how much, I don't know. Above that, the thalamus coordinates the symphony of the brain functions. So there's the brain stem, and there's some really lower level stuff for motion and breathing, and then there's the reticular formation. Above that is a thalamus, and there's a conductor in the brain. It's not a homunculus. It could be purely, the electromechanical, but there is some coordination that's going on. That's what explains the brain wiring diagrams. At least that's a leading theory. The quality and the contents, perhaps, of consciousness may correlate, and Richard knows about this, with an EM field surrounding the brain. And that is what the evidence suggests at this time. And I'm sorry, I meant to put to research the references for this last part here. The part about the brainstem's reticular formation, you can do an internet search for that, and consciousness and brainstem reticular formation, and you're going to find out about it. The last part, I think Richard he probably has the reference at this point. So to end things, maybe we need to know something practical, because psyche, if type, psychological type, and I understand why it was called personality type, because that makes it more approachable. Psychological type means maybe something clinical, and is this Isabel Myers person going to tell me that I'm have like some kind of disorder or something? No, it's a personality. It's a more friendly word. But if psychological type is at the level of psyche and it's something about consciousness, we can't observe it directly. So how do we observe it? At present, we can't, but there is a technique from mathematics called reconstruction analysis. It's used a bit in forensic investigations. It's used in geometry. It's a method to strongly infer the likely character of something. So for a phenomenon, an object, a something, a thing, with n dimensions, let's say a 3-dimensional object, we can reconstruct it by observing its surface projections. In other words, its shadows. So if we see a shadow cast on the wall of a rectangle, and then on the floor a circle, we might be able to infer, with putting down some money, that there's a cylinder that is in that space that we can't see, that's causing those shadows to form. The more projections, in other words, the more shadows we consider, as long as they're coherently aligned in a shared graph space, which means that we're working with different models, but they're coherently aligned in a way. And that is Linda Barron's work on temperament interaction styles, cognitive processes, and whole type, that those are 4 different shadows, and that we can reconstruct what's there. I am thoroughly open to there being other methods, and in theory we can have many different shadows, but I think they're sort of diminishing returns. Maybe that cylinder, we want to find out, is it hollow, or is it filled on the inside, and then we need another projection? Does that cylinder have some indentations in it or something like that? We want to get more shadows. So in the Jungian sort of Myers-Briggs types, in anything that's about consciousness, I mean, there's other frameworks that are about consciousness too, we can use multiple complementary methods. And I believe that neuroscience is one more method to greatly aid our understanding. And it's sort of what I'm trying to do is to present the neuroscience data in a way that is helpful, not just accurate, which is different from precise, that's accurate and is also helpful in that endeavor. In the future, higher resolution images in space and time, you know, the brain imaging is, this is the century of neuroscience, like it's only going to continue. More sophisticated relevant techniques to analyze the raw data. I think some techniques are really going to fall out of favor when people realize that they're not really measuring what people, or they're not, the patterns they're showing don't correspond to things that are really there, that we can act on, or that show up using other techniques. Use of different or synergistic imaging technologies, complementary tracking heart rate, eye movement. There are people working on all of this right now. Longitudinal studies on the same or similar persons. So I've had very few individuals come back. I mean, I'm one of them, but there's only one of me. And there's a few other people who've done it twice, the brain imaging. But for the most part, I look at people, I compare age within the same type, and that's how I sort of simulate longitudinal work. And that's sort of the directions that things are going in. And then this is about me, and I think we can end here and take questions.